Last week we talked about the poor in spirit, and that all of us, to one extent or another, fall into that, because from the world's standpoint, Christians are really, for many of the non-believers, Christians are the losers. We're the ones that have the wrong priorities. We don't put the same priorities on life as the world does. We have a priority that's based on Jesus, and we are moving closer and closer each day to being like him, and that doesn't fit in. We look like the losers, and yet Jesus says, you losers are and already have the kingdom. That's kind of good news. But along with it comes another counter statement that is totally doesn't make sense. It's a paradox. Why did he say this? Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Happy are you when you mourn. Happy are you when you're sad. Jesus' statement is a promise of hope to those who have, are, or will be experiencing loss in their life. The word mourn carries with it in the Greek, carries with it the idea of mourning, of grieving, of being sad, of bewailing, if you will, the sense of loss. One who mourns is one who was, and will experience real loss in their life. And that takes on many, many different forms. We're not just talking about those really deep valleys in which we've lost a loved one. We're talking about every single time that you have been looking towards something or planning on something or thinking something or having something, having experiences, having relationships, and somehow or another losing that relationship, even by steps. This is what is really about mourning. It's about loss. And the word comfort that he uses there has been translated as, in many translations, God will restore your happiness. And also, God will console you. So when he says, be happy for you who mourn, you will be comforted, it means that you're going to get back to a sense of real peace with God. You will be consoled. You will find center. You will find the hope. You will gain back the light. In other words, the good news that we're hearing today is really saying to us, with Jesus, there is light at the end of the tunnel. There is always light at the end of the tunnel. This word of hope to those who are poor in spirit and mourn can also be found in Isaiah 61. Isaiah 61:2 says this, the Spirit of the sovereign Lord is on me because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from the darkness of the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. That's from Isaiah. This has been a key element of God toward his people since the beginning. Even when he had to eject Adam and Eve out of the garden, his whole goal was to bring them back into some kind of relationship. He spent the time to give them the clothing. He spent the time to get them out of the garden because he loved them so much and not have them for eternity be stuck in that situation. He had to let them go. If this kind of sounds familiar, it's what Jesus spoke at his message in Nazareth when he wrote this, when he said this in Luke 4:18 and 19. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. His coming was the Lord's favor. His coming was the kingdom that we have the blessing to experience. So, the fact is this: grieving, mourning, and loss are part of being human. And as much as we try to avoid it, you can't. We can't escape any of it. You will always have loss. You will always have grief. You will mourn. You will be hurting. You will go through all of those experiences. You can't escape it. It's what it means to be in this flesh. Everyone experiences grief and loss. All of us mourn to one extent or another. And our lives are molded by those experiences. Mourning is a part, actually, of God's plan. Paul understood what it means to grieve and how grieving brings us to experience his comfort. He writes in 2 Corinthians 7, 9, and 10, he says this, that now I am happy, not because you were made sorry, but because your sorrow will lead to repentance. For you became sorrowful as God intended, and so were not harmed in any way by us. We didn't do it. Don't blame us for the pain that you're experiencing, for our trying to correct you, and for the things that you're going through. Godly sorrow brings repentance that leads to salvation and leaves no regret, but worldly sorrow always brings death. In other words, all this grieving, all this pain, all this frustration and confusion you're going through is meant for a purpose. Because we don't change when we're happy. We don't change when we're on the mountaintop. We just enjoy the mountaintop. And we do everything to stay on the mountaintop. We do everything we can to be happy. We want all of that good stuff for us. But where our lives are transformed is in the valleys. It's in the pain and the suffering. And how we go through that determines the character that we have. Some of the very basics of what you think in life should be have come out of those experiences. Most of your personality is really based on some of these experiences, not necessarily the good stuff, but because of the bad stuff. Now, this has been kind of interesting to me because when I was in college, I remember this, and it was reminded to me when I got into seminary. But when we go through grief, when we go through loss, when we mourn, it has been observed that we have certain things that happen to us, and we experience certain feelings that go on with us, and our actions reflect those feelings. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, in the early part of the 19th century, wrote in her book called On Death and Dying, she noted, after observing many, many people who have been going through grief and pain, noticed that there were 5 stages that these people tended to go through. And over the years, as psychologists read the book, and it's become a staple in psychology, which, remember, psychology really doesn't solve your problems. Psychology is really good for observing and making observations. It's what science is supposed to be. And what we see here is that over a period of time, other psychiatrists and psychologists have added 2 more to this list. And so there are basically 7. And each one of these you will go through. With very few exceptions, you will go through them. Sometimes through a long period of time, sometimes very short, sometimes with a very thought. But you will go through them all. It's part of being human. And so when you're struck with loss, whatever it might be, first off is the first idea of disbelief. How could this possibly happen? How could this happen? It can't I don't understand how this could happen. And some people in shock get to the point where they're unable to even think. You will see people in shock where they're just sitting there and their eyes are glazed over because they haven't been able to figure out or compute this. How do you deal with it? The second phase or thing that happens is that we go into a form of denial. Couldn't have happened. Didn't happen. Children do this when they're faced with the idea of divorce or the loss of one of the parents in some way, by death or divorce. The children get in their heads, especially in divorce, they get in their heads that this is only a temporary thing. After all, mom and dad are going to get back together again. Isn't that? That's our hope. That's what we want. And so we deny the fact that the parents are separating. We actually, in many ways, deny, in fact, in some cases, very clearly deny that the parent has died, or the spouse, for that matter, has died. And so he's just away on a vacation. We convince ourselves of those things. And so we live in a form of denial. We live in the form of denial that someone has said to us, I don't want to be your friend anymore. And that pain is so great that, no, he didn't mean that. He didn't mean that. We live in a form of denial when something happens wrong to us, and we want to pretend it doesn't happen. And from denial, reality sets in. And our first response many times is just plain anger. We're frustrated, we're angry. It's one of the things that happens when you lose a spouse. Many times, many times, the one that's left will go through this stage where, why did he go first? Why did he leave me with all these bills? Why is it I'm in this situation like I am? Why did he have to go? I am so mad at him. I am so mad at the situation. I am so angry. And that comes out. It does really come out in people when they're going through grief. And all of a sudden you're talking with them, in the minute that you say maybe a trigger word or you do something, and all of a sudden they just lay into you with verbiage that you never knew they knew. And they didn't know they were doing it either. Because anger is a part of this. You got to cover up the pain. What's the best way to cover up pain? You get angry. Get those endorphins going. Get all that adrenaline pumping. Get everything feel alive again. But you got to leash out at somebody, some people. Sometimes losing a child. Each of the parents that lost that child, they lash out at each other. And they don't even know they're doing it. They love each other dearly, but the next thing you know, they set up a whole pattern of things in which they end up, well, they say, I've kind of left each other. We've fallen out of love, and we just don't have that same spark anymore. When in fact what it is they've experienced a loss so great and they didn't know how to deal with it, and they set in motion things that hurt each other and hurt each other and hurt each other. And because they haven't the mechanism for forgiveness, it all begins to turn into dead love. Dead love. And then after anger, and after you realize that you've gotten so angry, and sometimes these don't necessarily happen in the same order, but they all are there begins a bargaining. Children say, if I only behave better, Dad will come back. If I only do this, then this will be okay. Some of us will do other things in the bargaining. If I do, God, I will come to church if she will come back and live with me. I will do anything. Tell me what I want to do. I will do it, and if I do it, you will do this. Back and forth, you will bargain. And that doesn't necessarily happen, does it? But after bargaining and not working, after being angry and not working, you look at the situation in so many cases as children with losing parents, they begin to feel guilty. It's my fault. I did it. I did it. I spent too much money. I did this. It's all my fault. And those losses may not have anything to do with you. Those losses are part of what life is. If I had only seen the signs, my husband would still be alive today. If I had only forced him to go to the doctor, he'd be okay. If only. Guilt. Then there's depression. There's depression. That depression is where all of this that's come over you is so hard to deal with, and you're so frustrated and you don't know what to do that you turn all of that anger, all of those feelings inward, so you don't even have energy to get up in the morning. One of the definitions of depression is anger turned inward. You can't do anything. You're helpless. There's nothing you can do about it. And so you turn all of that anger, that frustration back inside. So you're incapable of, in many cases, of functioning. You sleep in. You're sleeping all the time. You don't want to talk to people. You don't have any energy anymore. Everything seems black. You may be given an insurance from your spouse's, from the estate that is several hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it doesn't mean anything. All it is another black thing to take care of. And depression leads to destruction. And then finally, after going through all of these phases, and it takes sometimes years, sometimes within seconds. For example, the whole denial thing can be just simply a thought that goes through your head, and then you realize reality. It may be that you get angry after you lash out at your brother, or you lash out at a spouse, or you lash out at someone, and you realize what you're doing, and you back off, and you get a sense of what's happening, and you move to the next one. You may have guilt before you get denial. All of these have different things, but it all comes back down to there is a point in time, over time, sometimes a lifetime. But over time, there comes a point of acceptance where everything comes to peace. We pass through each of these steps, but we can be stuck in one or more of them for years. They can all of a sudden find themselves, after going through all of those steps, and never ever gone through real grief. I remember the time that a woman told me that she was standing doing dishes at a kitchen sink, and she was looking outlet that she has done hundreds and hundreds of times, and she's been doing the dishes, and everything seems fine. She had gone through the funeral a few years before, gone through the funeral. Everyone was surprised at how strong her faith was, how she seemed to have it all together. She'd gone through some of those things, and yet all of a sudden, out of all of this, years later, she started to cry. And she couldn't figure out why she was crying. Everything was going fine. Everything was fine. Her friends were there. Everybody was, it was just great, but she was crying and she couldn't stop. Finally, she got some help, and she went and talked to a doctor, and the doctor sat with her, and as they started talking, he could quickly see what the problem was, and he says, you're finally grieving over your husband's death. And she began to realize that, and very soon after that, she resolved it. I remember when my dad died and my mom died. They died within months of one another, and it was really a surprise to all of us to lose both of them in the same year. And I really surprised how I responded. I was feeling guilty. I went through a period of guilt because I didn't show any kind of feelings. I was sad, but nothing was happening. And then one day, Vicki had gone out shopping, and I was sitting there watching TV. And I don't know what it was, whether something on the TV or just that moment. All of a sudden, I started crying. And I went, wow, where is this coming from? And I was crying. The tears were coming down my cheek. I don't cry very often. And I'm going, this is really strange. What's happening? And then popped into my head, you hadn't grieved yet. And the minute I accepted that, all of a sudden the tears came even more. And I said, oh, thank you, Jesus. I just let it happen, and let it happen, and let it happen. But these all come from a scholarly point of view, and from the doctor's point of view, you finally, they have their definition of what it means to accept is pretty low. Acceptance can mean merely being able to be able to cope and manage throughout the day. In other words, you get through the day. You're not happy, you're not excited, you're not looking forward to things, but you're existing. You're getting there. You're paying your bills, you're going and visiting people, you're coming to church. Everything is there, so you're functional. But God doesn't say that. He says the acceptance, the idea of being comforted, is not about just being there. Jesus came to give us an abundant life, a life full and rich in him. And so when he talks about comfort and the idea of reaching acceptance, he's talking about something far greater. The thing about going through grief is that each one of these moments of grief changes us. And they can change us for the better, or they can change us for the worst. Now, they change us. And how does it, anything. I'm still not the same. I know when I started, I know what it feels like. I was so frustrated and angry, and I was in denial. I did all those stages when I was just about 10 years old, and our dog had bit a friend of ours had bit a neighbor. He was in quarantine for 10 days. They didn't know. But Dad had to take him and put him away. I don't know what he did, but I think he just took him to the pound. All I know is when he told me that, I grabbed my dog and I sat on top of his doghouse, and I cried and I cried and I cried. And I don't remember very few other times that I cried, because I didn't want that pain anymore. And so my personality changed. The same thing goes with any kind of loss. After a period of time, it doesn't have to be a big loss. It just has to be a series of small losses. And you begin to change. Your personality changes. You become stronger. You become angrier. You become a person who lives in their fantasy land. You become something else. You're constantly evolving. It does it to all of us. You and I are a product not of the mountaintops necessarily, but how we went through the valleys. God said that you will be comforted, and are currently, in the middle of all of the mourning even, are currently blessed because you mourn. This is a part of our lives. Some of you are carrying hurts and pains that are years and years old. You're carrying things that happened to you when you were a child, and you have carried that with you, and it has held on to you. Psychologists in counseling, one of the things about going through one's life and looking at one's life in the midst of counseling is to find those triggers that happened, and that out of that you became a little different. Why is it you lose your temper like you do? Partly because maybe your parents had tempers and you copied them to some extent. But when loss came, that became a way. And that became to affirm that idea of anger. And you became more dominant. You covered up your feelings. You covered up. Men are great at that, don't they? To really talk. We dare not do that. We're supposed to be strong. And when we were weak, the other guys picked on us, so we dare not be weak. We got to be strong. We got to hold on to it. We got to be in control. Women, you've gone through pain, and we wonder why you become such a strong woman, because you're afraid of the loss that you've experienced in the past. All of that is there in the midst of all that you are. There is no individual like another individual, because you are all going through all of this cacophony of experiences differently and interpreting them differently, and you're walking through them, and yet God allows that to happen to you so that you can learn from them and grow from them. Even now, things that have happened to you years and years ago, God can bring that to mind, can move you out of what has imprisoned you to free you to be what he wants you to be. This is the good news. But it takes us to realize it. Us to realize it and let people speak into our lives, to hold a mirror up so that you can see as you're going through grief and as you're working through mourning, as you're walking through. And I've met individuals who are so wonderful people, wonderful people, and yet you say 2 or 3 words in the wrong order, and immediately it's like they turn around on a dime, and all of a sudden they become the most hateful individual you ever saw in their lives. And once they get it out there, they blow their, once they've gotten it off their chest, they sit back and they may even have to go to apologize. But by then the damage is done. Man, you're so shocked you can't trust them anymore. You don't know when they're going to blow up. Maybe that's part of the reason why they're that way. They went through a period of time, and that's how they learned to cope, and that's how they learned to get to acceptance. And they never really saw that. But God sees it. And he cries for you. He hurts for you because he wants you to get over all of that junk. Remember, when we're born again, the old has gone, because the new has come. But if you're so afraid of feeling the pain of loss that you keep holding on to everything that you have, you are going to constantly be in a state of mourning, a state of anger, a state of denial, a state of grief, you're constantly moving through all these phases over and over again. And you can be doing this with many aspects of your life. You can be going through several different aspects of grief and going through different times of loss, maybe feeling loss, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 losses at the same time. And they kind of build on one another. And at any given time, based upon that, you're in any given place and all of that. See how confusing it is? But it's where we are. We are a very complicated people. We have so much going inside of us that we don't even realize we're doing. And so it's no wonder that all of a sudden when we go to get rid of pews, everyone gets angry. Or many people get angry. When all of a sudden we make a change in the church, there are people who just really get frustrated and angered. And where's that coming from? It's all of that pain of loss, that grief that they're going through. But they can't accept that as being grief. They just have a rational reason why that shouldn't be changing. We do it in church. We do it with our families. So how do we experience God's comfort and embrace our grief? Embrace the grief? Yes. How do we stop from running away from pain and beginning to embrace that pain as a point in fact that we can move through that pain? We have been given the power by the Spirit of God to move through that pain and grow out of that pain. First is to accept the loss as real. Accept it, that you're going to go through loss. Loss is a part of life. I don't care what it is. You may love that car that you got when you were a teenager, and it is 70 years old. But I guarantee you, one of these days, it's going to get gone. And you can't take it with you when you go to heaven. That's the greatest loss movement in the bunch, is when you go to be with God. Everything stays put. You cannot take it. I don't care what your situation is. It may be where you put all of you remember the junk drawers that, I think you all have junk drawers, don't you, in the kitchen? Or some of you do. The more organized don't, but we have a junk drawer. It's a place that's a kind of a catch-all. And it's a place that's very important because we don't know what is in there, but we don't want anything gone from there. Because we feel a loss. We feel loss when we all of a sudden don't get the same amount in our checks. We feel loss all the time. It's always with us. Somehow, when we're kids, we feel we're never going to lose anything. But the fact of it is, it doesn't make any difference. You will grow out of the clothes you wear. You lose those clothes. You grow out of the bed that you slept in. I'm sorry, at 10 years old, that mattress is smaller than when it was when you get to be 16. All of those things happen to us over and over again. And I can tell you right now what it feels like to lose the ability to work in your back. I'm still grieving the fact that I can't do the things that I used to do. And I have to work through it. I have to compensate for it. And I still get angry about it. And I still deny it. Tell Vicki when she tells me, is that going to hurt your back? No, it's not going to hurt my back. I'm still going through this stuff. Why? Because I don't want to accept it. But it's part of what it is to be a person. The older you get, the more you have to accept loss. I can't run like I used to. I can't think like I used to. I never could remember names, so that doesn't bother me too much, but I know that that's the case. All of us do it. It's part of what it is. When I go to see the doctor, when he says, how do you feel today? Or how's it going with you today? I said, all I have to say is time. And we both get a good laugh. Because each time I go to visit the doctor, I get another little thing on my chart that says, well, he's experiencing this today, and I got a physical coming up at the end of the year here, and I know when I walk in there, I'm going to have something else. He says, oh, okay, let me add it to the list. Time. It's there. We lose. And how we come to it is to accept it. The fact that you're terminally ill is to accept it. Accept it and say, I'm going to do whatever it's necessary, but the fact of it is, I'm going to die. So rather than live in denial, I can sit down and I can make out a will, I can figure out where things are going, I can start giving things away, I can start organizing and figuring out my life for Vicki so that she can do the things that I've been doing for her and with her. I can sit there and I don't have to worry about it. Because I can accept the fact that this is the fact of life. It's loss. And he does that intentionally. Second, intentionally practice worship, prayer, study, service, and community. That sounds like going to school, but it's not. It really is a part of our lifestyle of practicing worshiping, that is surrendering to God, prayer, that is speaking honestly to God and learning to speak honestly with God. And it takes time and practice to do that because none of us really know how to talk to God at first. And we start to try to mimic other people who talk to God. And you start to use those same words and you start to practice mimicking those things. And that's not prayer. That's mimicking. Just saying the Lord's Prayer doesn't do squat. Unless you're understanding what's going on inside your head and you really mean those words, and that's an outline for prayer, and that you're going to go ahead and be honest with God. Honesty with God takes time because you've been lying to yourself and you lie to other people and you're such in denial about what's going on around that it takes time for you to see that and become aware and to grow in it. So prayer is practice. Study takes practice. Kids today and adults today say, I don't have to know my math. I don't have to know my times tables. I don't have to know how to add and subtract and divide. I don't have to know that. That's what I got calculators for. Bah humbug. Until the day you're trying to buy a car and the guy on the other end is giving you a contract and all these numbers are running through your head and they don't know what it is. And the next thing you know, you're walking out of there paying more for the car than you thought you were paying for because you didn't have the numbers behind you to be able to back up what you were saying and be able to understand what was going on. You don't have time to get there. Excuse me, let me get my calculator out here and double check what you're saying to me. You don't do that. Everything that you're learning in school seems so stupid at the time. And yet most of it, not all of it, but most of it is absolutely essential to get you ready for an adult life. But kids know more at that age than we do. But I've learned. I've regretted it since. We must intentionally choose to trust God. We have to intentionally trust Him. There are two words that sound exactly the same, but mean something entirely different. There's the word morning and the word morning. Notice it? You might see these words pointing us in two radically different directions. The first, morning, M-O-R-N-I-N-G, is like a half-filled glass. The morning recalls the start of a new day. It's the sun that will come out in the morning, and there's hope in the morning. Lamentations 3:22 and 23 gives the same kind of idea when he says, when the writer says, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassion never fails. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. In Isaiah 50, verse 4, Isaiah writes, the sovereign Lord has given me a well-instructed tongue to know the word that sustains the weary. He wakens me morning by morning, wakens my ear to listen like one being instructed. So the morning, that idea of the sun coming up, we start a new day. I get that way in the new day. My attitude is usually very, very good early in the morning. My best time is early in the morning because when I get out of bed, there's a whole new day ahead, and I'm always looking forward to it. So my glass is getting filled and half filled and getting fuller. But there's the other side of that. It's like the empty glass. You can choose the M-O-U-R-I-N-G, and that is that everything's just, it's another day, bah humbug. The psalmist writes in 42:9, he says, I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I go about mourning, oppressed by the enemy? So how do we experience comfort, peace, and acceptance that God is giving us as his children, citizen, and ambassadors? Well, if you notice the stages of grief, all of them are centered on one thing: me. It's I, you. Shock and belief is all within you. Denial is all about you. You're doing that. Bargaining, it's all about you being in control and making your bargaining with God and other people. It's guilt, it's centered on you. It's depression, it's centered on you. Anger turned inward. If you want to turn your mourning into the M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G into hopeful laughter, then you have to take the you out of mourning. You have to take you out of mourning and focus on Jesus that makes all things new. The way you get away from all of the stuff of grief is to get rid of your self-centered you and turn your attention back to God. You turn mourning into morning. A police officer, maybe I told you this story. A police officer had just had an accident. He was a motorcycle police officer and had an accident in his shop. He was using the jointer, and some of you know what a jointer is. Well, I'll just have to say he messed up. He tripped, and something happened. And he still to this day, as far as I know, didn't know exactly what happened. All I know is that something went wrong, and into his hand he lost all of his fingers, the first 3 fingers, and the tip of his little finger, and he kept his thumb. And that was horrible. And he was in the hospital, and I went to see him. He was a member of the church, and I went to see him, and there he was with his hand after surgery. And they told him that he had lost all 3 of his fingers. He had this little bitty little part of his the first knuckle on his, had lost the first knuckle, so he had 2 knuckles on his little finger, and he had his thumb. And he was a motorcycle cop. His whole life he wanted to be a motorcycle cop. He loved riding motorcycles. It was his passion, and he lost it. He lost it. When I first saw him, he was still groggy from surgery, and so he didn't talk much, but But he was given that information after the surgery, and he had told me what had happened. But he didn't say anything. He didn't do any, really didn't speak much about it. He was just too groggy. A week later, I went to see him, and he was like a different person. He was very verbal. He was very talking. He was very upbeat. And I went, "What happened?" And he said, "Well, I'll tell you what. This was not a good thing." He said, "When I finally realized, it finally came to me that this is real and that I'd lost my hand," he said, I wouldn't be able to ride a motorcycle because that's your clutch hand. You use that in the clutch. And so he wouldn't be able to clutch, and he wouldn't be able to ride his motorcycle, and he became very, very, very depressed. He said, I went through, I didn't know the stages that well at that time, but he described them, all of them. He'd gone through all of them. And he was sitting there, and I'm going, "Okay, what happened? How are you doing now?" And he says, "Well, I was laying in bed last week, and I was crying. The tears were just coming down my face, and I could hardly see. I was so crying and so angry and so just crying. My stomach was churning. Everything was upset. I was so upset. And then across the room at this Catholic hospital, there was a crucifix hanging on the wall." And he said, "I saw that crucifix, and I saw my hand. And I said, Jesus did that for me. He gave me life. And he went on the cross and he gave up his life for me. This is only a minor problem. He's got something for me. And I know it's going to be okay." He got out of the hospital, and he was first put on desk duty. And of course, he couldn't drive a motorcycle anymore, but he stayed a cop. And he has a motorcycle at home. And he rides that off-road. And the reason why he can is because God provided the two knuckles were just enough to be able to get a hold of the clutch and pull it in and work the clutch. God has everything ready for us if we but use and listen to him and be willing to accept those things that we've had happen to us are part of what God's plan is. As human beings, we're constantly mourning over so many situations, but the psalmist writes this in Psalm 35. "For his anger lasts only a moment, but his favor lasts a lifetime. Weeping may stay for the night, but joy comes in the morning."